Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. In a statement today, President Trump confirmed the attack by US bombers on Iran's underground nuclear facilities. This comes after a week in which Israel has been carrying out its own dismantling of Iran's leadership, military capability and nuclear structures on the ground in Iran. Given the US involvement in a new theatre of war and Russia's relationship with Iran, what impact does this have on the war in Ukraine? Well, to help unpack the implications, we are joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University College Dublin. Professor, welcome back to TVP World and thank you for taking the time.
Good morning to you and your viewers.
Thank you. So, so much has happened in the last 24 hours. What is the impact on Iran's support for Russia, or the other way around?
Well, we await to see the extent of the damage from this U.S. strike on 3 Iranian nuclear sites, including their hardest to reach site, which is buried deep inside a mountain, a place called Fordow. We won't exactly know the extent of this in terms of its relationship with Russia until Iran decides how it's going to respond to the American operations. And at this point, they are not giving an indication of that. All they have said is the foreign minister has said, we are going to respond at a time of our choosing and where necessary. Likewise, we have not had a statement from the Kremlin in terms of where it stands regarding the American attack. What I would say, however, is that from the standpoint of capabilities, Iran, to say the least, is very much on the defensive. It was already on the defensive over the Israeli strikes, and now its options to respond either directly to the United States or in its relationship with other countries, it's very much in survival mode.
Right. What is then the impact on Russia's ability to wage war? For example, there has been some kind of quid pro quo between the two countries. It started with the provision of Shahed drones by Iran to Russia at the beginning of this part of the war, but it has developed since then. Can Russia no longer rely on Iran for such exchanges, military or economic?
I think that the question of Iran's military provision to Russia is going to be strained at this point, not necessarily in the supply of the drones, because those processes have been set up now for going on for 2 years. And as you have mentioned, we're talking about tens of thousands of Iranian drones that have been supplied in those ongoing Russian attacks to try to break Ukraine. I think the real strain is actually in terms of Iran's military leadership to maintain relationship with with Russia and to take this further, and indeed on its political leadership. The Israelis have proclaimed that they have killed 21 of 22. That's all but one of Iran's top military commanders with the strikes in the past 9 days. And I don't think that assessment is far off the mark, given how effective Israel's been with the targeted assassinations. It also has hit key political leaders. So I think Iran's ability to maintain communications with the Russians about that relationship, where it goes next, as Russia is under great pressure from other parts of the international community, I think that's going to be tested. I think in a broader sense, as we're seeing with the news that you are reporting from other areas of the world, Iran is going to have to be very careful where it moves with other countries, including the Russians, because they do not know how far Donald Trump will go in expanding this war.
Understood. But, okay, very briefly, if you would, because I do want to move on to another topic. Very briefly, sir.
Sure.
How does this undermine Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine, if at all?
Okay, first of all, I think it's important to assess how Russia responds in terms of with Iran. Whether Russia tries to build up the relationship with Iran or whether it pulls back because it wants to keep Trump happy. But on your main point, look, Vladimir Putin is going to continue to try to break Ukraine. We just had the outrageous statement only 2 days ago that all of Ukraine is Russia. So he's going to maintain that effort. Now, has he been able to advance? He's only been able to advance with all that Iranian support, with the North Korean support, very gradually in the east of Ukraine and in the northeast. There have been some advances, but they're very limited. More importantly, I think Ukraine's been able to strike back and hit a number of Russian sites. I would say here that we are in a marathon, not a sprint, that Russia is not on the verge of breaking Ukraine, and that in a small way, not in a critical way, but in a small way, this impact on Iran is going to further limit Putin being able to carry out his bluster. In other words, that he has the military capabilities to make Ukraine surrender.
Understood. Now, with Iran, with Russia taking stock, and with President Trump's focus on the Middle East at the moment, what does that mean to the U.S. Provision of military and other aid to Ukraine?
Well, amidst all the unpredictability and the chaos of Trump, at one point criticizing Vladimir Putin, and then at another point carrying out and amplifying the Kremlin's lines about his attacks, the administration had quietly lifted the suspension on U.S. military aid to Ukraine. So they had allowed 50 caliber ammunition to go to Ukraine. They had allowed F-16 parts, spare parts to go to Ukraine. Now, that was aid that was authorized under the Biden administration. I think the question of how much further the Trump administration goes, you have to look at Trump's advisors, where there's a battle going on between two camps. The camp, including J.D. Vance, that wants to restrict the aid, the camp led by Keith Kellogg that wants to maintain it. And you have to look to the U.S. Congress, which not only wants to tighten sanctions on Russia, but wants to bolster assistance to Ukraine. So I think it's in the balance how far the U.S. will increase assistance.
Is this an opportunity for the voices within the United States government to actually push the Ukrainian agenda further while President Trump is focused on the Middle East?
I think so. And I think there'll be an immediate response that says, oh, Trump is so preoccupied with the Middle East that everything else will go onto the back burner. But I think what's interesting is that when Trump gets a focus on a particular issue, he doesn't really have the attention span to look at what's happening elsewhere. And I think the effort by those who want to at least maintain the American assistance to Ukraine, and I think vitally to continue links with the Europeans, who I think now are key alongside Kyiv, I think that gives them some space to operate. I think what's important is to watch, say, a J.D. Vance as vice president, to watch those who might have opposed the American assistance to Ukraine, whether they try to take advantage of this. And my impression is at this point they aren't. My impression right now at this point is that there has been a big split in the Trumpist movement over these bombings of Iran. And I think Vance and others are going to be concentrating and trying to hold the Trumpists together on the Middle East. And as you mentioned, that may give a window for the Europeans to try to work with the adults in the room in Washington, not for the U.S. to take the lead, but for the U.S. to support European efforts in backing Kyiv.
Well, clearly we'll be watching that very closely. Now, zooming out a little bit, in terms of the American strategy in the Middle East, a couple of days ago, President Trump said, when asked by reporters what his plans were with Iran, he said, well, I'll make a decision in a couple of weeks. 2 days later, U.S. bombs attacked nuclear facilities in the country. The 2 weeks, smokescreen, or was the decision made at the very last minute?
That's a great question, and it could have been either. I was asked all day yesterday whether Trump had retreated with that statement, attacks within 2 weeks, having said they were imminent. And I said at that point, he could either be trying to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security, much as the negotiations with the U.S. had lulled them into a false sense of security before Israel attacked 9 days ago. Alternatively, this could be the chaos of Trump and the unpredictability of Trump. I think the wider point is this, there is no U.S. strategy here. There is no U.S. strategy in terms of the long-term play, because what has happened is Trump is not leading. He has been played by the Israelis to follow. If I had spoken to you only a week and a half ago, we would have been looking at a sixth set of U.S.-Iran negotiations that were going to take place. We were going to be looking at whether the Trump administration was going to accept a limited Iranian nuclear program. And then the Israelis pushed all of that to the side. And how did they do that? They went to Trump and they said, we're going to attack. We're going to do this. You might be able to get your deal with Iran after we have punished them, after we have ripped the country apart. And that indeed is what Trump is saying if you look at his statements. There's still a deal. Iran can still make peace now that they've been attacked. In other words, the source of the U.S. attacks on Iran, or specifically Donald Trump's attacks on Iran, come from the Netanyahu government. They assess Trump very, very well. They put him into a corner, back us or oppose us, and he has backed them to the hilt.
Understood. But it's not only Israel and the US. I mean, the Arab governments in the region have also been somewhat muted in their responses. They're allowing the use of their airspace for both Israeli and US jets. What's going on in that dynamic?
Now, I'm not sure the Gulf states specifically are the ones who are allowing the airspace going into Iran. I think there's other routes, but I think your broader point is right, in that the Gulf states are caught between two objectives here. One is they're unsettled. They will be unsettled by the Israeli strikes on Iran and now by the U.S. strikes, because there could be repercussions for them. I think Iran's capacity to strike the Gulf states is quite limited, but you still have, for example, the Houthis in Yemen, who could actually cause trouble in the Gulf area and in the Red Sea. And I think in a broader sense, the Gulf states, while they have been rivals of Iran, they do not want Iran to be destroyed. They don't want Iran to be thrown into chaos, because it could spread instability, which will unsettle their plans for years to come. On the other hand, they don't want to upset Trump. Only a few weeks ago, they hosted him because they were getting American IT. They were getting other American high tech. They were getting American AI. In other words, they were getting these transactions with the Trump administration that was going to boost their own objectives.
Understood. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt you there, Professor, because we are running short on time. But thank you very much indeed for your analysis, and have a good day, sir.
Thanks to you and your viewers.
Thank you. Bye-bye now. That brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.